It might be easy to forget that in America, Jews arrived primarily for economic reasons, but while they were here, they were developing a culture and a religious style. The religious style that they chose, however, is based on something that happened 100 or so years before they came to America in Europe. You may remember the term Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was something in the early 18th century. It involved individualism, skepticism, judgment, questioning of authority, and in early 18th century Europe, this was something rare. There was at that time really only one form of Judaism, and that was Orthodoxy. Now, Orthodoxy is a relative term, because you can only be Orthodox if there's something that is non-Orthodox, but we'll call it Orthodox for the point of argument at least. The Enlightenment brought three special insights into the situation. One was a consciousness of the development through history. Up until 1700 or so, people had thought that history was all the same. If you look at medieval art, pictures of biblical scenes are all just about like medieval Italy. But beginning around 1700 or 1750, people began to understand that over time things really did change. There was development, and that was very important. The second thing that they began to discover was the importance of various languages. Excuse me. They began during the Italian Renaissance to study Latin and Greek with a new intensity, and then they began to find other languages like Arabic and Hebrew, and even some of the other ancient Near Eastern languages. And as they did, they began to look at texts like the Bible with a new intensity. Part of this had to do with the aftermath of the Reformation, because Martin Luther said, if you go back to the text of the Bible, you will understand truth. Well, what was the text of the Bible? And the Catholic Church wanted to say, well, wait a minute, no, your understanding of the text was different than ours, and we can prove it based on different languages, different analysis of language. So there was a renewed interest in textual criticism that began to emerge around this time. And when you begin to criticize the text with the skepticism of the Enlightenment, you begin to open the door for change. The third thing that happened was that Bible, especially, was translated into vernacular languages. Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. Other people translated it into English. And as that happened, more and more people, even more and more scholars, began to have access to the text. When they did, they began to ask questions. And that was the beginning of a change in religion for both Protestantism and for Judaism. The result was a willingness to be skeptical, to have doubts, and to be open to change. In Germany, and to some degree in areas around Germany, especially Hungary, they began to experiment with changes in Jewish practice and in Jewish theology. They would begin to drop customs and behaviors that seemed foreign, especially in relationship to other Europeans among whom they lived. They especially wanted to get rid of behaviors that they saw as Eastern European, that were really alien to the cultured life of sophisticated 18th and 19th century Germany. Chief among the people who we ought to know about in this sense is a man named Moses Mendelssohn. And he was a brilliant scholar. In an essay competition, he bested Immanuel Kant and won the first prize. Moses Mendelssohn was an Orthodox Jew all his life, but he opened the door for modern scholarly criticism of Jewish practice and behavior. Among the other things that they did were to add the organ in services, to add mixed seating of men and women. They shortened the service considerably, and they began to add a sermon in the vernacular that people could understand. Ritual clothing was often abandoned. They got rid, or tried to get rid, of eating habits, kosher food, and at one point even they tried to outlaw circumcision. The prayer service became uniform, in unison. Davening, that is the kind of bowing and movement of Eastern European Orthodox Jewry, was forbidden, and there was a great deal of decorum. People behaved differently. What they wanted to do, frankly, was to make the service more modern, make it in keeping with the values of the Enlightenment, but also something that their neighbors, Protestants and Catholics, could respect in a new way. The first liberal service was held in a small chapel in a boys' school in a town called Seesen in Germany in 1810. A year later, in Hamburg, the first Reformed congregation was founded. And it soon spread to other cities. But the Orthodox were not about to have this happen, and they pushed back. They appealed to the government to shut down the reformers. And in some cases, the police actually did. So reform, and by the way, it's never reformed with an ED at the end, it's reform. Reform Judaism never made a lot of headway in Germany because of the pressures and the traditional resistance. But in America, conditions were different. They were better. For one thing, there was separation of church and state, and so the police and the state could never intervene in a religious dispute. No government interposition, no government pressure was possible. The second thing that was important in America is that there was no Jewish establishment or power structure. Nobody had been here long enough to establish a uniform claim to being able to say what American Judaism was all about. There were no long-standing traditions, especially among Germanic Jews here in America. The third thing that's important, and maybe this is the most important, is that getting settled in this new world where there were few Jewish infrastructures required a lot of compromise and flexibility. Sabbath observance was difficult. Many people had to work on Saturday. They had to compete with their non-Jewish neighbors. There were few communal services available. You couldn't go down the street to a kosher butcher or bakery, to a synagogue or a school. You might not even live in close proximity to a Jewish community. So if you wanted Jewish services and you lived outside of one of the major communities, often you had to relocate during the Jewish holidays or Passover. Now, as we've said before, by 1720, the majority of Jews in America had come from Northern Europe. But the critical mass, the numbers, began to arrive in the 1820s and 30s. And the first Jewish synagogue that catered exclusively to Germanic Jews, Ashkenazim, was founded in 1825 in New York. It's called B'nai Jeshurun. And it depended on having enough of a mass of German Jews who wanted something different from the Sephardic or Spanish-Portuguese ritual that they had to adopt, because that was what was done in America. Up until then, communal governance was held by the Sephardic elite. And if you wanted to be part of the community, you had to accept what they decided. After about 1825, you began to see a break in this uniform monopoly. In Charleston, South Carolina, in 1824, a man by the name of Isaac Harvey instigated a rebellion in the synagogue called Beth Elohim. They wanted to make it into a more liberal and modern synagogue. And so 46 congregants signed a petition to change the congregation's practices. Well, there was a considerable amount of conflict in the synagogue for the next 8 years. And finally, in 1836, after Harvey had left the community, the congregation reverted to its more traditional practice. There was no structural support in Charleston, nor was there any structural support across the country for a widespread movement to liberal Judaism. That happened after the 1840s. A man we've talked about before, Isaac Mayer Wise, arrived in New York in about 1845, and very soon he was the rabbi of a congregation in Albany, New York. He unilaterally decided to make changes in the ritual of the congregation. He believed in rabbinic authority based on the European model that the rabbi had the right to change things on the pulpit. The laity did not necessarily agree, and they challenged his right. This was a characteristic American reaction to authority. The rabbi in the congregation in America was not a freestanding employee of the total Jewish community, but of the congregation. And the congregation felt, we're paying your salary, we have a right to tell you what to do. In the high holidays, that is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur of 1850, the president of the congregation confronted him actually on the pulpit about mixed seating, the choir, and the organ. Now, legend has it that the two got into a fist fight. I don't know. I wasn't there. But the result was that Wise very soon had to leave the congregation. He had two choices. He could go to Charleston, South Carolina, where there was a receptive group, or he could move across the mountains to Cincinnati, that growing community on the Ohio River. He chose Cincinnati. It's possible that he understood that something was going to be happening in the South in the next decade or so, and that his life there would be very different. In any event, he made the choice, which was a fortuitous choice, of going to Cincinnati. American Judaism, west of the Appalachians and in the South, was going to be liberal Judaism or Reform Judaism. Wise built a movement. Something that hadn't been true of Charleston earlier now occurred because Wise did it. Part of it was the sharing of information. He had two newspapers. They reported information from all over. And he traveled incessantly, back and forth, community after community, and brought information about what was happening here to there and there to here. In 1855, he tried to pull together the rabbis of America in Cleveland to see if we couldn't have a uniform form of Judaism. He strived for a united theology and a common platform. Most American denominations at that point were beginning to have a conflict over slavery. The Methodists broke up into Southern Methodists and Northern Methodists. Presbyterians did the same thing. Not Jews. Jews broke up because of a claim of authority about the Talmud, which is a book of Jewish law that was published in Babylonia about the year 600. Orthodox Jews believe that this oral law, this law of the Talmud, has the same authority as the Bible. Reform Jews say it is a guidance, it's instructive, but it doesn't have that kind of authority. They could not find a common ground. The 17 rabbis who came to Cleveland split on this. And particularly, there were a group of very radical reformers from the East Coast. David Einhorn, whom we've met before, Samuel Adler of Temple Emmanuel in New York, Bernard Illowy of Baltimore, Rice of Baltimore, Morris Raphael. Some of the more traditional rabbis boycotted the conference because they said, we know what Wise is up to. And there was not going to be any agreement. At the same time, Wise in Cincinnati tried to establish a Jewish seminary called the Zion Collegiate Association. It did not work because, again, there was no structural support, no congregational movement yet that would support and sustain this kind of effort. Orthodox Judaism in America was also growing as more and more people came from Europe. Big cities like New York and Philadelphia had an influx of traditional Jews, although most of them stayed in Europe. Still, there was a critical mass developing in America. The economic impulse to immigrate, despite the fact that there was no persecution of consequence, led many of them to think the grass is going to be greener in America. And so you have a series of rabbis, S.M. Isaacs, Morris Raphael, Isaac Leeser, Bernard Illowy, coming to America and saying there are possibilities for the growth of more traditional Judaism in America. Now, Jews in mid-19th century America wanted their religion to do several things for them. All of them wanted to have a Judaism that would somehow insulate or cushion them from the impact of living in a new place. They wanted, in this new and alien environment, to have something that was familiar, that they could lean on and trust, even if it was a little bit different. They wanted a way of sustaining themselves, some part of their original identity that would keep them intact as a separate group, even though they had to make change in America. Orthodoxy tried to reproduce as much of the ritual and practice and feeling as they could. They wanted it to be as much like the old homeland as possible. This required living in proximity to each other because, of course, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, you had to walk to synagogue. Proximity meant that people could support each other. Liberalism was much more adaptive to the new surroundings. It made the immigrant feel more comfortable as an American. He could remain Jewish and still be part and parcel of America, even if there were no other Jews around. So it was a straddling of two different identities. And it became the most popular kind of compromise for Jews in America in the 19th century. One of the functions of religion is to educate its younger members. Literacy, as we have seen, is critical for being Jewish. In Judaism, the way you find out what God wants you to do is you go to the written text and you study, and you argue, and you debate, and you eventually come to a conclusion, this is the right way. But in pre-Civil War America and shortly after the Civil War, this was a problem. Now, attempts had been made as early as 1836 in Philadelphia to solve the problem. That beautiful woman, Rebecca Gratz, whom we've met before, established the first Jewish Sunday school in Philadelphia. She didn't have any books. There weren't any. There were no kids' books about Judaism. So she took Christian catechisms, books of questions and answers about religion, and she pasted over Jewish answers in the books for the kids. And they studied with her, and they had tests and contests with other judges to see who would answer best. Most children had individualized tutors. There was a reluctance among Jews to attend public schools. Why? Because in this period of America, the public schools were in fact adjuncts of the Protestant establishment. Some of you may have heard of a book called McGuffey's Reader. McGuffey's Reader is the most widespread early childhood text that was used in public schools. And the way it's organized is that there's a letter, and then there's a bit of doggerel verse next to each letter that the kids were going to memorize. So for the letter A, the doggerel verse said, "In Adam's fall, we sinned all." Well, that's good Protestant theology, perhaps, but it's not Judaism. So they didn't want to expose their kids to this kind of indoctrination. So they created eventually private Jewish schools that would teach secular subjects, but they were under Jewish auspices, and they were, of course, only in major Jewish population centers. And then something happened. In the late 1840s and 1850s, a new group of immigrants came to America, Irish Catholics. The potato famine in Ireland had killed as many as 3 million people. Large numbers of Catholics came to this country, to Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and some other cities. And the Protestants who were running the schools got scared, because they understood that while they presently controlled the school system, this large number of Catholics could easily outvote them and take the control away from them. And if the Catholics took over the schools, they might in fact change the kind of indoctrination that was happening in the public schools from Protestant to Catholics, and we certainly don't want our kids exposed to this papist conspiracy. That's what they had done. Just at this time, a great educator named Horace Mann arose in Massachusetts. His motto was, "Our public schools are not theological seminaries." He approved the teaching of morals based on more generic and biblical religion, but not based on one particular form or denomination of religion. This was the first step towards secularizing the public schools. When that happened, then Jewish parents were much more open to the idea of sending their kids to public schools. So, for example, in 1850, 56% of all kids in America went to public schools. Jews 54%. But in 1860, the number had risen to 59.6% for public schools for everybody, but Jews had gone from 54 to almost 67% in the public schools. In other words, once the schools became secular, Jews found them much more acceptable, and the private Jewish academies began to disappear. So what do we summarize about Jewish religion in America? We understand that over the time, Jewish religion in America was liberal, adaptive, and helpful in making Jews feel American and settle into the American society.